All right, shalom, shalom, shalom. You are live and direct once again with your Akazaki Yahoo, giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahweh, Bashem, Hamashiach, Wamalak, Yahweh Shai. I'm joined this evening by my most esteemed Ak Kenaniah. Shalom, my king.
Hey, shalom, shalom, my king. Shalom, Yasharal. Call Halal Yahweh. Bahashem, Hamashiach, Wamalak, Yahweh Shai. Barakatham.
Hallelujah. All praises to Yahweh in the name of his beloved son, Yahweh Shai, the Messiah. Bless you. We are back with another video review, and we have a couple of powerful videos for you. One from the good brothers over at Black Journals, and another one from Black Culture Unlocked. We're going to begin with Black Journals. This happened at Jackson State University, the 5th month, the 15th day in 1970. So let's get to it and get through it. And I hope it's not too bad.
Came back that evening. There was another little incident. But everything settled down. Everything had settled down. That next night, all of it started on the 14th. So the 15th was when we heard the marching.
May 15th, 1970 is a day that can never be forgotten.
And we watched as they approached the campus. They were marching as if they were marching to war. They were in lines. It appeared to be hundreds of them. I don't have a count, but as I go back, I know there was a lot of them. And we watched them from the window, and they marched down Lynch Street.
Get on the ground! On the ground! On the ground! Face down on the ground! Face down on the ground! Hands behind your back! Hands behind your back! Get him! All right. You bleeding? Yeah, I'm bleeding. Hand! Give me! Where you shot at? In your leg? Back of my leg. Back of your leg. All right. Ready?
On that day of terrible memories, there was screaming and cries of terror everywhere at this point.
Yes, sir. Hey, guns right there. Guns right there. What? Right there. I need one more unit, Ocala.
Pain mingled with the noise of sustained gunfire as the students of Jackson State University struggled en masse to get through glass double doors. Several of the students were trampled in the process. Others would be struck by buckshot pellets or bullets, who fell, only to be dragged inside or left moaning bitterly in the grass. Everywhere was in a horrible disarray.
It was the highway patrol and city police. Everybody on both sides of the campus, they came up Lynch Street.
Whatever may have actually occurred on that day cannot justify the indiscriminate killing that had taken place after.
The only communication I heard back from the police officers came from a highway patrolman who stepped up with a megaphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?"
Please.
And it was right after that the shooting started.
All hell broke loose. Shooting.
The police had opened fire at approximately 12:05 a.m. midnight, May 15, and had continued to fire at the young offsprings of black parents for more than a good 30 seconds.
It was just like something out of a movie. When you're watching a war movie and you hear hundreds of guns shooting.
It was quick, thoughtless. The students scattered about. Some would run for the trees in front of the library, while others would scramble for the Alexander Hall West End door.
And when we realized that we were being fired upon, we turned and fell to the floor. I remember feeling something hot hitting my back.
And when they shot, we pushed right through that door right there. And we went through there, you hear the bullets popping off the wall like firecrackers. And so after zigzagging like that, we were lucky. Many of us didn't get killed.
And all you could hear was, oh. I was on the ground. And I kept seeing all this fire going over my head, and I kept pulling the grass. so I could get where I needed to get.
Somebody holler out, stop firing, or hold your fire. And I got up and ran into the dormitory.
When the order to cease fire was given and the gunfire ceased, Philip Lafayette Gibbs, age 21, a junior pre-law major with a wife, a child, and a baby on the way, lay dead 50 feet east of the west wing door of Alexander Hall.
I knew Philip. I'd had classes with him.
Philip, that was my classmate. Double doors. Man. They lit him up in the back first. He was trying to get in. And when he turned around, he was like this. And they used M16s and 30. And it was so, boom, took him through those doors.
2 00 buckshot pellets had punched into his head, while a third pellet entered just beneath his left eye and a fourth just under his left armpit. Many more were down, lifeless. The 5-story dormitory was riddled by gunfire. Investigators estimated that more than 460 rounds struck the building, shattering every window facing the street on each floor. Bullet holes that can still be seen in the walls of the building till date.
I don't think there's any way you can justify firing 460 shots at a girl's dormitory for 29 and a half seconds. I don't see anything that justifies that.
That year, 1970, was a pivotal year in American history. The Vietnam War was raging on at this point in time. Widespread protests and anti-war movements would inevitably become the order of the day. On college campuses across the nation, students had begun to demand change, seeking justice, equality, and an end to the war. In Mississippi, a state scarred by racial tension and segregation, Jackson State University would stand as a beacon of hope, a historically Black college, a hub of intellectual and cultural vitality. But beneath its surface, tension simmered. 11 days after the National Guard troops fired into a crowd of unarmed anti-war protesters at Kent State University in Ohio, local and state police in Mississippi would open fire on a group of students at Jackson State College in Jackson. In a 30-second barrage of gunfire, police had fired 150 rounds into the crowd, killing 2 Black students and injuring dozens more. What in the world actually happened? What led to all of this? Before we go on, if you've watched up to this point, then it would mean that you've settled in for the ride. Don't forget to support our works by hitting the thumb button. Share video with friends and family to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to stay tuned in. Okay then, without further ado, let us dive in. As at May 1970, tensions were running high. The Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement had created a perfect storm of unrest across America. Protests against the war and demands for racial equality were sweeping the nation. In Jackson, Mississippi, these tensions were worsened by deep-seated racial divisions. The African-American communities there relentlessly faced segregation, discrimination, and police brutality. Jackson State University, a historically Black college, was a hub of activism and resistance. The killing of Martin Luther King Jr. just 2 years prior still weighed heavily on the community. Students and faculty at Jackson State University were actively involved in the civil rights movement, seeking justice and equality. As the anti-war movement gained momentum, students across the country demanded an end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The recent Kent State shootings, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students, had sent shockwaves through the nation. Against this backdrop was the Jackson State College shooting. Tension on the Jackson State campus had been mounting for some time, not from Vietnam, but from something much closer to home, racism, which frequently was played out on Lynch Street, a major thoroughfare dividing campus and used by white motorists. Before part of John R. Lynch Street was made into the Gibbs Green Plaza and walkway, it was a road that ran through the middle of the campus into downtown Jackson.
Lynch Street, during that particular time, and even before, was a thoroughfare for white people to get to and from their jobs to their homes. There was a red light at Alexander Hall and across, B.F. Roberts, right there. But cars used to come through there quite often. And the white citizens used to come through, and sometimes they would holler out or scream out obscenities and throw eggs and, bottles, and bricks, or what have you. Using the N-word.
By 1970, many white citizens have had to drive down Lynch Street and pass through Jackson State to get to their jobs downtown. Some of them would intentionally try to hit or run over students who were on their way to class or walking back to their dorm in Alexander Hall while driving through. Sometimes when white drivers stopped at the traffic light outside Alexander, they would yell racial slurs or throw glass bottles at the students who were outside.
We were constantly subjected to racist taunts. The women were always shouted out, and some sexist remarks was made to them. And I think one of the speakers for this year's occasion, Mamie Crockett, was hit by a car when she was crossing the streets here one time here at Jackson State. So, civil rights, this being Jackson, Mississippi, a lot of civil rights activities, the freedom rides, the arrest of a large amount of students. Medgar Evers lived here. The COFO office, which was the spearhead of a lot of civil rights organizations, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Coup, the Congress for Racial Equality. They all had hubs here in Jackson, Mississippi. So for sure, civil rights had to be a part of the equation that led up to the tragedy here in May of 1970.
Tensions would escalate when a series of the hit-and-run incidents would further occur, with white motorists striking black students crossing Lynch Street. The repeated accidents would spark widespread concerns and outrage among Jackson State University students, prompting them to publicly demand action and safety measures. Despite the students' demands for safety and respect, the hit-and-run incidents and verbal harassment by white motorists would continue unabated. The constant stream of cars speeding through Lynch Street, coupled with the racist insults and intimidation, created a very hostile environment to settle in. Frustrated and fed up, Jackson State University students would decide to take matters into their own hands.
I came driving through here just checking things out. There were students all over the place down here on the corner in front of Alexander Hall. And all of a sudden they started throwing bricks and rocks through my windows and broke the windows out in this Plymouth station wagon I was in, a marked WJTV news vehicle.
I saw this car coming through and some bottles and rocks were being thrown at the car.
There was a red light back there in that science building, and somebody hollered out that Charles Edwards was shot, the civil rights icon of the state. And when they said that man put up at that red light, they said, that's behavior. Everybody throwing bricks at it.
The students would begin to retaliate against the abusive white drivers, throwing stones and other objects at cars that sped through the campus. Verbal confrontations would escalate, with students responding to insults from white motorists with equal force. This cycle of violence and retaliation would further inflame tensions, setting the stage for the tragic events that would sooner unfold. Young, a witness to the Jackson State University shooting, narrates his ordeal.
We had several nights of protests, not only because of what was going on at Kent State, but every campus in this country was in an uproar about the war in Vietnam,
said Young to the reporters.
Young black males were being sent to Southeast Asia in disproportionate numbers, and we were concerned about that in addition to the historic racism there in Jackson, Mississippi. So there were several nights of protests, and I was thinking that there would just be some taunts and jeers at the law enforcement officials present and thinking nothing more would happen. But shortly after midnight on that third night, early in the morning, May 15th, actually, those students were fired upon at Jackson State.
On the 13th of that month of May, 1970, Jackson State University students were found protesting because of these issues, as well as the tragedy which had happened only days earlier, the 4th of May, at Kent State University in Ohio, where 4 Kent State students, Allison Krause, Sandra Schuer, Jeffrey Glenn Miller, and William K. Schroeder, were killed by Ohio National Guardsmen. Let's engage in a quick moment to see what really happened to these young souls at Kent State University, which would lead to their untimely demise. It was the year 1968, and Republican Richard Nixon had won election as President of the United States. partly as a result of his pledge to end the Vietnam War. Lack of success in conducting the war, which had become a quagmire for U.S. forces, with mounting casualties reported on the nightly TV news with the regularity of sports scores, had forced Nixon's predecessor, Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson, to opt not to run for re-election, in no small part because of his vilification by the growing anti-war movement focused on U.S. college campuses. During the campaign, Nixon claimed that he had a secret plan to conclude the war, and hopes for peace had grown with the establishment of direct talks between the United States and North Vietnam in Paris, though by the spring of 1970, those negotiations had stagnated. Meanwhile, the Nixon administration had undertaken a strategy it called Vietnamization, the gradual shift of responsibility for fighting the war from U.S. forces to those of the Republic of South Vietnam, with a concomitant withdrawal of U.S. troops. On April 20th, 1970, Nixon went on national television to announce that 115,500 U.S. troops had been withdrawn from Vietnam as of April 15th, and that another 150,000 troops were scheduled to leave by the end of 1971. After escalating for some 5 years, American involvement in Vietnam seemed to be winding down. It was all the more surprising then when Nixon returned to television 10 days later, on the night of April 30th, to announce that U.S. and South Vietnamese troops were mounting a major invasion of Cambodia, which had provided a haven for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops. The bombing of Cambodia had begun in secret months before this announcement of the significant widening of the American war effort. Enraged responses swept college campuses across the country the next day, May 1st. Nixon's announcement of the invasion of Cambodia was greeted with several protests. At Kent State, 2 rallies were held at the Commons, a grassy open area at the center of the campus. The Commons formed a kind of natural amphitheater that was bordered on the north and south by walkways, on the northwest by the Student Union, a heating plant, and the Reserve Officers Training Course, ROTC building, on the east by Blanket Hill, a partially wooded slope that climbed to Taylor Hall, and on the southwest by dormitories. The first rally was held at the base of Blanket Hill, near the Victory Bell, a bronze locomotive bell in brick and sandstone housing that was traditionally rung to celebrate sports victories. There, attended by a crowd of some 500, a group of graduate students symbolically buried a copy of the U.S. Constitution, which they said had been murdered by Nixon. They also called for another anti-war rally to be held on the coming Monday, May 4th. Later on May 1st, Bus held a rally on the Commons to protest police treatment of black students at an earlier rally at Ohio State. That night, one of the first warm evenings of the spring, students and others gathered at the downtown bars. Sometime around 11 p.m., fueled by a mixture of alcohol and rage at the invasion of Cambodia, revelers overturned a garbage can in the middle of the street, set fire to its contents, and set upon the police who responded. When law enforcement officers returned in force to clear the streets, the revelers began breaking store windows. More than a dozen individuals were arrested, and the bulk of the students were driven from downtown back toward campus by police in riot gear. By 2:30 a.m., the disturbance was over. Nevertheless, in the early morning hours of that next day, Kent Mayor Leroy Satram, having heard rumors of plotting by radicals, declared a civil emergency and requested assistance from Ohio's staunch conservative governor, James A. Rhodes, who dispatched the Ohio National Guard. During the day on May 2nd, students helped clean up the damage downtown. More rumors flew about the threat of radical activity. At about 8 p.m., some 1,000 individuals gathered at the Reserve Officers Training Course, ROTC building, which some of the demonstrators then set on fire. As firefighters sought to contain the blaze, demonstrators pulled at and slashed fire hoses. With the conflagration burning out of control, elements of the National Guard arrived on the scene and cleared the area. By May 3rd, nearly 1,200 National Guardsmen, most of whom had been redeployed from duty policing a wildcat truckers' strike, occupied the Kent State campus. Governor Rhodes, who was campaigning for the Republican nomination to run for the U.S. Senate, flew on a helicopter to Kent to survey the scene. Presenting himself as a champion of law and order at the press conference that followed, Rhodes promised to use every part of the law enforcement agencies of Ohio to drive dissident groups out of Kent. Echoing Nixon, who had earlier called student demonstrators bums. Rhodes characterized the demonstrators as worse than the brown shirts, the communist element, night riders, and vigilantes. That night, students who were expecting a meeting with officials that never came blocked traffic on the edge of campus at the intersection of Lincoln and Main Streets. When the demonstrators grew hostile, the riot act was read, and the guard forcibly dispersed the crowd. Bayonets were used along with tear gas this time, resulting in injuries on both sides. Although Rhodes had failed to pursue his stated intention of obtaining a court order declaring a state of emergency, it was widely assumed that martial law was in effect and that control of the campus rested with the guard rather than with university officials. Demonstrations were banned, but despite the distribution of 12,000 leaflets announcing that prohibition, many students were unaware of it when classes resumed on Monday, May 4th. By noon, on that clear, brisk day, perhaps as many as 3,000 students congregated in and around the Commons. Gathered around the Victory Bell, roughly 500 of them were actively protesting Nixon's expansion of the war and the presence of the National Guard on campus. Another ring of about 1,000 individuals cheered their efforts, while some 1,500 more students watched from the periphery. Across the Commons, by the charred remains of the ROTC building, more than 100 guardsmen under the command of Brigadier General Robert Canterbury confronted the demonstrators with Garand M1 rifles loaded with live ammunition. Canterbury's order that the demonstrators disperse, delivered from a jeep at about midday, was not adhered to. After launching tear gas at the demonstrators near the bell, the guardsmen began advancing with bayoneted rifles across the Commons in two groups. The smaller contingent swept up the left flank of the slope, forcing demonstrators back and blocking the passageway between Prentice Hall and Taylor Hall to the east. Meanwhile, the larger force marched up Blanket Hill to the west of Taylor Hall, with demonstrators parting or retreating up and over the hill. On the other side of Taylor Hall, the guard descended onto a football practice field that was fenced on three sides. The most aggressive demonstrators were in the parking lot of Prentice Hall, several hundred feet away from the guard, so that most of the rocks they threw fell short of their target. More students lined the grounds around Taylor Hall. During their 10-minute stay on the practice field, a number of guardsmen knelt and aimed their rifles at demonstrators. Another group of guardsmen huddled briefly, later prompting speculation that in that moment they had conspired to shoot at the demonstrators. Having effectively dispersed the demonstration but feeling threatened, the more than 70 guardsmen in this contingent would begin retracing their steps up the reverse side of the hill toward the Commons. At 12:24 p.m., as they reached the crest of the hill, near an umbrella-like concrete architectural feature known as the pagoda, 28 guardsmen quickly wheeled back and over the next 13 seconds fired between 61 and 67 shots. Some of the guardsmen would discharge their weapons into the air, some others at the ground, but a reasonable number of them would fire into the crowd. 4 students were killed and 9 others were wounded, one of them paralyzed from the waist down. 2 of those killed, Jeffrey Miller and Allison Krause, who fell about 265 feet, that is 81 meters, and 343 feet, that is 105 meters away from the guard, respectively, had been actively involved in the demonstration, but the other 2 fatalities, William Schroeder and Sandra Scheuer, both shot at a distance of about 390 feet, that is 119 meters, were bystanders on their way to class. The closest victim of the shooting, Joseph Lewis, had been standing about 60 feet, or 18 meters, away from the guard. Later, there would be much debate over why the guardsmen had fired, whether they had been ordered to do so, whether they thought they had been fired upon themselves and shot in self-defense, or whether a small group of them had indeed conspired to shoot. In the chaos that immediately followed the discharge of the weapons, the guard returned to the Commons, surrounded by an enraged throng whose belligerence threatened to explode into violence that might have been answered by another fusillade by the guard. At this combustible moment, faculty marshals, led by Glenn Frank, a geology professor, successfully persuaded the students not to endanger their lives by taking on the guard. The Commons was evacuated, and Kent State Pres Robert White ordered the university closed, which had effectively remained for some 6 weeks. The Kent State shootings had provoked the biggest student strike in the U.S. history, which involved hundreds of campuses nationwide. The iconic photograph of a young woman screaming as she knelt over the body of a student was published across the national press. and came to symbolize the political and cultural divide in the U.S. at the time. Going forward, the entire outbreak at Kent State was a bottom line for what was now taking place only more than a week on in Jackson State University. The students would amass themselves on Lynch Street, and a peaceful student protest would unfold on campus. On that day, approximately 100 students would march and chant slogans along the streets, calling for racial equality and an end to the war. Governor John Bell Williams would order the highway patrol to establish order on the Jackson State campus, and the students did not resist. The next day, the president of the school would meet with the students twice to listen to their concerns, but tension would continue to mount. Around 9:30 p.m. on May 14, Jackson State University students would hear a rumor that Fayette, Mississippi Mayor Charles Evers, brother of murdered civil rights activist Medgar Evers, had been killed alongside his wife. On hearing this, students would again gather on Lynch Street and begin rioting. Amidst the riot, the Reserve Officers Training Course, ROTC building was set on fire. A streetlight was broken and a small bonfire was built, but the riot was still, however, a small one. At this time, several white motorists would call police to complain that students had thrown rocks at their passing cars, but eyewitnesses would later prove that it was non-students, known as corner boys, who did the rock throwing. Jackson firefighters dispatched to the blaze met a hostile crowd that harangued them as they worked to contain the fire. Fearing for their safety, the firemen requested police backup. The police, who later told the media that they had received reports of gunfire in the area around the college, up to an hour and a half before they had responded to the call, would block off Lynch Street and cordon off a 30-block area around the campus. National Guardsmen, still on alert from the riot the previous night, would mass on the west end of Lynch Street. Mounted on armored personnel carriers, the Guardsmen had been issued weapons but no ammunition. 75 city policemen and Mississippi State police officers armed with carbines, submachine guns, shotguns, service revolvers, and some personal weapons would also arrive at the scene. The combined armed presence on the Lynch Street side of Stewart Hall, a men's dormitory, would stave off the crowd long enough for the firemen to extinguish the blaze and leave.
That evening, there was another little incident, but everything settled down. Everything had settled down. That next night, all of it started on the 14th, so the 15th was when we heard the marching.
And we watched as they approached the campus. They were marching as if they were marching to war. They were in lines. It appeared to be hundreds of them.
After the firemen left, the police and state troopers marched along Lynch Street toward Alexander Center, a women's residence, weapons at the ready, and no one seems to know why. Falling back before the approaching officers, the students would congregate in a thick knot in front of the dormitory. At this point, the crowd numbered 75 to 100 people. Several students allegedly shouted obscene catcalls, while others would chant and toss bricks at the officers, who at this time had closed in to within 100 feet of the group. The officers would then deploy into a line facing the students. Accidentally, someone in the crowd either did drop a bottle which shattered on the asphalt with a loud pop. At the same time, an officer fell, struck by a piece of thrown debris.
The only communication I heard back from the police officers came from a highway patrolman who stepped up with a megaphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?" And it was right after that the shooting started. The bottle broke in the middle of the police officers, and they started firing.
By that time, one of the students threw a bottle, and the bottle burst. All hell broke loose. Shooting.
And from here, the entire story would take a new turn as different eyewitnesses give their various encounters.
And we watched them from the window, and they marched down Lynch Street. And as they came from the west, and they passed by the young men with the fire, and they came, continued till they got to the front of Alexander Hall. And we came across the hall, and looked out of my dormitory room window.
It was the Highway Patrol and City Police. Everybody on both sides of the campus, they came up Lynch Street. I was the fence on the south side of Lynch Street in front of B.F. Roberts Dining Hall, along with other friends of mine. And on the north side were students laying on the ground in front of Alexander Hall and just, hanging out the windows.
But they marched on up there and they said, we're going to kill some of you niggas.
The students, in my experience for the first time in the civil rights movement, were really saying nasty things to the police officers. They were calling them pigs, telling them to get off the campus. You don't have any business here. We don't need you here. And they were doing it at close range. I'd never seen that happen at close range before. Usually there was great distance between protesters and police officers. It'd usually be, several hundred feet. But here they were, police officers right in the middle of this street, and the protesters right over there, and you could hear each other very well.
Accounts vary as to what happened next. Some students would say that the police advanced in a line, warned them, then opened fire. Others would say that the police abruptly opened fire on the crowd and the dormitory. Some other witnesses as well would report that the students were under the control of a campus security officer when the police opened fire. But the police themselves would claim that they had spotted a powder flare in the Alexander West Hall third floor stairwell window and opened fire in self-defense on the dormitory only. 2 local television news reporters present at the shooting would agree that a shot was fired, but were uncertain of the direction. A radio reporter on the corner would claim to have seen an arm and a pistol extending from a dormitory window, but all these were done to prove the policemen innocent and off the hook. Going forward, whatever did actually occur, the police, it was said, did open fire at approximately 12:05 a.m. midnight, May 15, and had continued to fire at the young offsprings of Black parents for more than a good 30 seconds. It was quick, thoughtless. The students scattered. Some would run for the trees in front of the library, while others would scramble for the Alexander Hall West End door.
And when they went to kneel, I ducked, I dived under the trees that was on this side of West Hall. And they had me pinned down by the wall and I couldn't get up. And bullets was flying all over my head.
It was just like something out of a movie. When you're watching a war movie and you hear hundreds of guns shooting. And when we realized that we were being fired upon, we turned and fell to the floor. I remember feeling something hot hitting my back.
And when they shot, we pushed right through that door right there. And we went through there, you hear the bullets popping off the wall like firecrackers. And so I was zigzagging, like, we were lucky. Many of us didn't get killed. If I had to start down low, shooting low, I wouldn't have been here today to tell you about it. They would have gotten me.
And all you could hear was, oh. I was on the ground. And I kept seeing all this fire going over my head. And I kept pulling the grass so I could get where I needed to get.
There was screaming and cries of terror everywhere at this point. Pain mingled with the noise of sustained gunfire as the students struggled en masse to get through glass double doors. Several of the students were trampled in the process. Others would be struck by buckshot pellets or bullets, who fell, only to be dragged inside or left moaning in the grass.
Philip, that was my classmate. Double doors. Man. Whew. They lit him up in the back first. He was trying to get in. And when he turned around, it was like this. And they used M16s and 30-30s. And it was so, boom, took him through those doors.
When the order to cease fire was given and the gunfire ceased, Philip Lafayette Gibbs, age 21, a junior pre-law major with a wife, a child, and a baby on the way, lay dead 50 feet east of the west wing door of Alexander Hall. 2 00 buckshot pellets had punched into his head, while a third pellet entered just beneath his left eye and a fourth just under his left armpit. Across the street, Behind the line of police and highway patrolmen, James Earl Green, 17, was sprawled dead in front of Benjamin F. Roberts Dining Hall. Green, a senior at Jim Hill High School in Jackson, was walking home from work at a local grocery store when he stopped to watch the action. He was standing in front of Benjamin F. Roberts Hall when a single buckshot blast slammed into the right side of his chest. The police later claimed that they had taken fire from the direction of Benjamin F. Roberts Hall. 12 other Jackson State students were struck by gunfire, including at least one who was sitting in the dormitory lobby at the time of the shooting. Several students would require treatment for hysteria and injuries from shattered glass. The injured students, many of whom lay bleeding on the ground just outside the dormitory, would be transported to University Hospital within 20 minutes of the shooting. But the ambulances were not called until after the officers picked up their shell casings. This was what the U.S. Senate probe conducted by Senators Walter Mondale and Birch Bay later revealed. Injured and carried to University Hospital for treatment were Fonzie Coleman, Red Wilson Jr., Leroy Kenter, Vernon Steve Weekly, Gloria Mayhorn, Patricia Ann Sanders, Willie Woodard, Andrea Reese, Stella Spinks, Clemmy Johnson, Tuwayne Davis, and Lonzie Thompson. The 5-story dormitory was riddled by gunfire. FBI investigators would estimate that more than 460 rounds struck the building, shattering every window facing the street on each floor. Investigators counted at least 160 bullet holes in the outer walls of the stairwell alone, bullet holes that can still be seen in the walls of the building till date. The police and state troopers would leave the campus shortly after the shooting and would be replaced by the National Guardsmen. After the incident, Jackson authorities would deny that the city police took part in the fusillade, that the highway patrolman fired was never at issue. At the Jackson hearings, the administration, faculty, staff, and students testified that till date, there had been no convictions or arrests. In closing, the Jackson State shootings exemplify the entrenched racism and social injustices of the 1970s in America. The tragic loss of Philip Gibbs and James Green, coupled with the injured students, underscores devastating consequences of systemic racism and police brutality in the U.S. No convictions or arrests were made, highlighting impunity and lack of accountability. This incident was part of a broader narrative of racial tensions and violence. We remember the victims, acknowledging the event's impact on the civil rights movement and ongoing struggle for racial justice. Confronting America's painful past and present, we strive for a future where such tragedies would never have to repeat itself ever again. This brings us to the end of yet another touching video on the painful history of the people of color in the U.S. Do not fail to support our consistency by hitting the thumb button, share video with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and kindly consider subscribing and stay tuned in with us if you are yet to. We are delighted.
So they slay our people as recently as the 1970s en masse and hold themselves not guilty as if they've done absolutely nothing wrong. And even to this day, our people find ourselves in that very same predicament where they just constantly just come against our people and make us into victims of their aggression, victims of their gunfire, victims of their evils, and they say that they've done absolutely nothing wrong. And they walk around as if everything's going to somehow just be okay. But I got news for you. Despite all of this evil that has befallen this people, our captors, our oppressors, the evildoers of this people will not get away. Accountability will be had. And I know this was 1970, and here we are in 2024, heading into 2025, and they're not going to get away. They will not get away. I'm going to rest there. Go ahead, Art.
1970, my father was in maybe his second year of college when this incident had taken place. My mother, I think, was probably graduating high school that same month, I believe. It blows my mind how these things. I mean, 1970 was 51 years ago, or 54 years ago.
54, yeah, right, going on 55.
Yeah. So, that really wasn't that long ago. And I mentioned that because we still desire to have a seat at their table rather than ensuring that we have our own.
Right.
These people who probably did this crime, like a lot of these people are probably still around. Like now, they're probably elderly, but they went on to raise families and probably instill these same values in a lot of their family members. Mm-hmm. It's upsetting that we're still, we've been doing these videos for about a year, a little over a year and a half now, mm-hmm. somewhere like around there. I would have thought that we would have run out of information to cover.
No, not at all.
But sadly we haven't, and I think the perpetrators of these acts and the people behind them thought that all of this would just go away and that nobody would remember and nobody would talk about it. But you're sadly mistaken. We will address all of the issues that affect our people. And like Mark said, you feel like you've gotten away with this, but you haven't. You haven't.
Not at all. Not at all. It's just a matter of time, and your recompense will come. Recompense will come, and I assure you. All right, we're going to switch over to this next story here. This was Wilmington's dark day. The coup that erased Black progress. So this comes to us from Black Culture Unlocked, and we're going to get to it. Here we go.
In the final years of the 19th century, Wilmington, North Carolina, was a prominent beacon of Black progress and resilience. Here, a thriving Black community rose to prominence despite the lingering shadows of slavery and the aftermath of the Civil War. Wilmington was more than just a city. It was a representation of what could be achieved when opportunity and ambition were allowed to flourish. But it was this very success that made them become a target. In 1898, Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina, and its demographics were a progressive deviation from the normal. Most of the population was made up of Black citizens, and their influence was cut across politics, business, education, and other sectors. Black professionals like doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs thrived together with skilled laborers and tradespeople. The government of Wilmington was racially integrated, with Black men holding esteemed positions. This was a rare and remarkable reality in the post-Reconstruction South, where deep-rooted racism sought to suppress Black successes at every point. At the center of Wilmington's success was The Daily Record, a Black-owned newspaper that gave voice to the community, championing civil rights and challenging racist ideologies. The Daily Record stood as a testament to the power of Black journalism in a dispensation where oppression and prejudice spread like wildfire. But as Black citizens in Wilmington rose to prominence, their achievements ignited a storm of resentment among white supremacists. This is the story of the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, a terrible moment in American history that exposes the extreme lengths white supremacy would go to truncate the progress of the Blacka just to maintain power. This event began as a peaceful and prosperous community that was transformed into the site of the only coup d'etat in United States history, a violent overthrow of a legitimate government that was influenced by hatred and racism against the Blacks. The Wilmington insurrection was not just an attack on a single city, but an attack on an idea. The notion that Black Americans could rise, lead, and prosper in a nation still struggling with its racist roots. The violent event of November 10, 1898, was a well-planned campaign of violence, displacement, and deceit. It was a chilling reminder of how far those in power would go to preserve a system built on inequality. In the coming moments, we'll expose the events that led to the insurrection, dissect the forces that fueled it, and expose the devastating consequences that lingered long after the smoke cleared. I know you don't know, but Wilmington was a symbol of hope and progress that was turned into a graveyard of black dreams. Its people betrayed, its history distorted, and its legacy hidden in the shadows of American memory. Beyond the tragedy, this story is also a testament to black resilience. Despite the horrors of the insurrection, the legacy of Wilmington's black community continues to stay alive. Their achievements, their courage, and their sacrifices are a reminder of the strength it takes to fight for justice and the importance of remembering the past to shape a better future. Like this video, as we look closely into one of the darkest chapters in American history, a chapter that demands to be told, understood, and never forgotten. Before we dive deeper, let's explore the events of 1898. We must first look back to the Reconstruction era. This was a time of profound change and opportunity for Black Americans. Years after the Civil War, the federal government implemented policies that were focused on integrating formerly enslaved people into society as free citizens. The Reconstruction Acts, constitutional amendments, and various federal initiatives laid the groundwork for black men to vote, hold public office, and establish businesses. In this era, Wilmington, North Carolina, became an example of what was possible when progress was allowed and given a room of expression. Wilmington was the state's largest city, situated along the Cape Fear River, and a critical economic hub due to its thriving port. Towards the end of the 19th century, the city was majorly populated by blacks, which made it one of the most racially integrated urban centers in the southern region. Black residents in Wilmington did not just survive, they thrived. The city became a haven for black entrepreneurs, educators, and politicians who were rebuilding the social fabric of the South. It wasn't perfect as racism persisted, but Wilmington offered a glimpse of what a multiracial democracy could look like in the post-slavery era. Black Wilmingtonians carved out a remarkable degree of economic independence during this time. Black-owned businesses were very common along the city's streets, catering to both black and white patrons. Businesses like grocery stores, barbershops, and real estate companies were included. One of the most iconic examples was the Daily Record, the city's black-owned newspaper. The Daily Record became a vital platform for advocating civil rights and addressing racial injustices. It was being edited by Alex Manley. Education also had a significant role in the success of the community. Some underfunded black schools were staffed by passionate teachers who were committed to uplifting their students, unlike their white counterparts. Some institutions, like the Gregory Normal Institute, prepared young black men and women for leadership roles in business, education, public service, and other fields. Politically, Wilmington's black population had quite a strong voice. Many black men were members of the Republican Party, which at the time was the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction. Wilmington's Fusionist Coalition, which was an alliance between black Republicans and white populists, took control of local government in the 1890s. This coalition created serious tension in the political atmosphere, threatening the traditional dominance of white Democrats. Black politicians served on the city council, holding positions like Justice of the Peace, and actively participated in influencing Wilmington's policies. For a brief moment, Wilmington's progress seemed unstoppable. Black residents were not just laborers or tenants, but were business owners, landholders, and prominent leaders of the community. They had carved out spaces of autonomy and influence in a society that had been built to oppress them. However, the successes of Wilmington's black community were not perceived as a good narrative by everyone. As the black community began to prosper and gained more political power, a backlash among white supremacists who felt their dominance was eroding them was ignited. The Democratic Party, which had been outmaneuvered by the Fusionists, sought to regain control by any means necessary. To these white elites, seeing black men holding public office and black families achieving economic stability became a threat to the racial hierarchy they were desperate to maintain. These white elites were not the only ones who were angry at the blacks' progress. Poor white farmers who had been courted by the Populist Party were also vulnerable to the rhetoric of racial division. Instead of uniting with black citizens over shared economic struggles, many were influenced by white supremacist propaganda that framed black people as the root of their problems. As though that wasn't enough, white-owned media exaggerated the narrative, making matters worse. Newspapers like Josephus Daniels News and Observer in Raleigh repeatedly agitated inflammatory editorials that were designed to inflict fear and anger among white readers. These publications made black men to be perceived as threats to white women, and black political leaders as corrupt and incompetent individuals who were not qualified for the office. It was an approach that was carefully designed to destabilize the fusionist coalition by turning white populists against their black allies. This growing racial tension created a tinderbox in Wilmington. At a glance, the city's government and thriving black community was a representation of their progress. But beneath what we see, white supremacists were mobilizing, determined to take back power and erode the interest of Reconstruction. The Fusionist Coalition was a partnership between black Republicans and white populists. This was both Wilmington's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. The coalition had been formed out of necessity as both groups shared a common enemy, the white Democratic elite. For some time, their alliance produced significant results. Together, they implemented policies that were beneficial to both black and white working-class citizens, like the reforms in education and infrastructure. This partnership was, however, insubstantial. While black leaders experienced fusionism as a gateway to greater equality, many white populists perceived it as a temporary compromise. Their loyalty to the coalition was often outweighed by their discomfort with black political power. When white Democrats began their campaign to dismantle fusionism, they exploited these tensions to fracture the alliance. The success of fusionists had also positioned them as a target for white supremacist violence. Black politicians faced threats and harassment, while black voters were often intimidated and oppressed at the polls. Regardless of these challenges, the fusionists managed to hold on to power, but their grip was not firm enough. In 1898, the stage was set for an extremely brutal confrontation. As the November elections of 1898 drew closer, Wilmington's black residents continued to push forward, even in the face of intense threats. The Daily Record published articles that challenged white supremacy and advocated for racial equality. Black business owners expanded their enterprises, and black families invested in their children's futures. But the tension in the air could not be hidden, as it has become obvious. Rumors of violence began to spread rapidly across the community, and white supremacist leaders openly called for the overthrow of the fusionist government. Despite their achievements, Wilmington's black residents knew they were living on borrowed time. Their progress had made them a target, and the forces of white supremacy were closing in. As the 19th century drew to a close, the political and social climate in the South was growing increasingly aggravated. However, despite the progress made by black Americans during Reconstruction, white supremacist groups and ideologies were rising to prominence, seeking to reverse those gains. The sole intention of this movement in North Carolina was the Democratic Party, which saw the integration and prosperity of black communities as a direct threat to their power and social status. Some white supremacist leaders like Furnifold Simmons and Charles Aycock came up with strategies to regain control of the state. Simmons, who was a skilled political organizer, was at the forefront, spearheading efforts to consolidate white voters by inflicting racial fear. Aycock, who is commonly known for his oratory skills, became a public face of the movement. They employed a fiery rhetoric to galvanize white citizens. They collectively orchestrated a campaign that combined political maneuvering with open calls for violence. The media was simply adding fuel to the fire. The editor of the influential News and Observer, Josephus Daniels, played a pivotal role in spreading white supremacist propaganda. The newspaper depicted black men as dangerous threats to white women and painted black politicians as corrupt and incompetent through inflammatory editorials and doctored images. These false narratives stoked white fears and intensified racial divides. This created an environment that would be a ground for conflict. The 1898 election became a pivotal event in North Carolina's history. Democrats were determined to overthrow the biracial fusionist government, a coalition of black Republicans and white populists that had held power since 1894. This coalition had implemented policies that were beneficial to both black citizens and poor whites. These policies challenged the traditional power dynamics of the South. To destroy this alliance, Democrats resorted to a campaign of intimidation, violence, and outright fraud. They mobilized a paramilitary group that was known as the Red Shirts. The Red Shirts was a violent offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan. These men patrolled black neighborhoods clothed in crimson uniforms, disrupting political meetings, threatening voters, and attacking those who resisted. Their presence had a clear message. Black citizens and their allies were no longer safe. The Democrats' strategy went beyond physical violence. They weaponized voter suppression tactics to ensure black citizens could not exercise their political rights. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and property requirements were implemented to disenfranchise black voters under the pretense of law and order enforcement. This approach, coupled with the constant threat of violence, severely reduced the participation of black individuals in political affairs. On the day of the election, the Democrats' plan reached its peak. Armed red shirts and other white supremacists positioned themselves at polling places, just to intimidate black voters and even stuffing ballot boxes. The result was a foregone conclusion that the Democrats reclaimed control of the state legislature, setting the stage for the violent events that would follow. One unforgettable moment in the lead-up to the Wilmington insurrection was the publication of a controversial editorial by Alex Manley, the editor of the Daily Record, Wilmington's black-owned newspaper. Manley's editorial, which was written in response to a speech by Rebecca Felton, a prominent white supremacist, challenged the existing narrative that black men were a threat to white women. Felton had claimed that white women were constantly under threat of assault by black men, and called for the lynching of any black man who was accused of such crimes. In his editorial, Manley exposed the hypocrisy of this argument, pointing out that many relationships between black men and white women were made by mutual consent of both parties. He also highlighted the systemic violence and exploitation black women faced at the hands of white men, an issue that white society refused to acknowledge. Manley's courage sparked outrage among white supremacists. The editorial was used as a rallying cry to justify the upcoming violence. White leaders narrated as an attack on white womanhood and Southern honor, whipping their followers into a frenzy. The publication became a symbol of everything they despised about black progress and defiance, further strengthening their resolve to crush Wilmington's black community. By the end of 1898, Wilmington had become a powder keg of racial tension. The fusionist government continued to hold power locally, despite the victories of the Democrats across the state. This local resistance infuriated white supremacist leaders who saw Wilmington as a final obstacle in their quest for total domination. Oftentimes, secret meetings were held among white leaders to plan the overthrow of the fusionist government. These meetings produced what came to be known as the White Declaration of Independence. This was a document that laid out their intentions to restore white supremacy by any means necessary. The declaration explicitly targeted black political leaders and institutions, demanding their immediate resignation and the removal of black citizens from positions of power and influence. The stage was set for a coup d'etat. The events that happened in Wilmington were not just sudden acts of violence, but the result of a meticulously planned and coordinated effort to put an end to black progress and reassert white dominance. With the groundwork laid and tensions at a breaking point, the city was on the brink of disaster. Let's go back to the early morning of November 10, 1898. Tension had been building in Wilmington for months, orchestrated by white supremacist leaders who were determined to overthrow the city's racially integrated government. That morning, their plans came to a violent implementation. At the center of the rage was the Daily Record, the only black-owned newspaper in North Carolina, led by editor Alexander Manley. The newspaper had become a symbol of black pride and progress, as well as a thorn in the side of white supremacists. Manley's bold editorial earlier that year challenged the racist myth that black men were predators, and defending interracial relationships had infuriated Wilmington's white population. That morning, a mob of armed white men marched to the Daily Record's office. They were determined to silence the voice of the paper once and for all. Over 500 mobs were led by Colonel Alfred Waddell, a former Confederate officer and one of the masterminds behind the insurrection. With torches in hand, they stormed the building and set it ablaze. Flames consumed not only the physical structure but also the voice of Wilmington's black community. This act of arson was more than just property destruction. It was a message that said dissent would not be tolerated. But the attack on the Daily Record was only the beginning. After torching the newspaper, the mob repositioned its attention towards the city's black residents, since they had silenced the voice that used to speak for them. Armed militias roamed the streets targeting black men indiscriminately. Gunfire rang out through Wilmington as groups of white men shot anyone they perceived as a threat. Eyewitness accounts described the scenes of chaos, black families fleeing their homes, many with nothing but the clothes on their backs, as the mob advanced, causing more violence. Although the estimates of the death toll vary, historians believe that the figure ranges between 60 to 300 black residents that were killed that day. A large number of the bodies were thrown into the Cape Fear River, erasing any evidence of the slaughter. The streets of Wilmington, once a bustling hub of black prosperity, were transformed into an unimaginable war zone. As violence began to spread even more, white supremacist leaders made their next move. They began to demolish Wilmington's government. They forced the city's black and white Republican officials to resign at gunpoint. Some of these people were Mayor Silas P. Wright and Police Chief John R. Melton. They were marched out of their offices under duress. In their place, Colonel Waddell and his allies installed themselves and occupied the positions of the new city government. This was not just a violent riot, it was a coup d'etat, an intentional and organized overthrow of a legitimately elected government. For the first and only time in U.S. history, an American city's leadership was forcibly replaced in such a manner. The violence was an outrage they had long anticipated. It had been meticulously planned and executed by white supremacist militias, including groups like the Red Shirts. These militias had been strategizing for months, armed with rifles, pistols, and even Gatling guns. Their mission was clear: to terrorize Wilmington's black community and eliminate any challenge to white dominance. The Red Shirts and other groups operated with impunity. Law enforcement, which was complicit in the coup, did nothing to stop the violence. Many officers had a role to play in the attacks or gave way for the militia to cause havoc. Wilmington was now under the control of white supremacy, enforced through violence and fear. At the end of the day, Wilmington's black community was extremely devastated. Thousands of black residents fled out of the city in search of refuge in the surrounding swamps or leaving North Carolina. These refugees abandoned homes, businesses, and belongings, often never to return. The once thriving black middle class of Wilmington was shattered. Meanwhile, the new white supremacist government quickly moved to solidify its power. They passed ordinances to disenfranchise black voters and ensure that no black person could challenge their rule again. This was the beginning of Jim Crow laws in North Carolina, which would spread across the South and last for decades. Wilmington, which had been a pillar of black success during Reconstruction, has now been transformed into a city dominated by fear and oppression. Black residents who remained lived under constant threat, and their political and economic power were stripped away. The coup did not only destroy lives, but also erase the progress that had been made since the end of slavery. The events of November 10, 1898 were a turning point. They showed the lengths to which white supremacists would go to be in control and served as a blueprint for racial violence and voter suppression all over the South. The Wilmington insurrection was not just a local tragedy, but a national crisis that revealed how fragile democracy is in the face of systemic racism. Days and weeks after the coup, white leaders worked to control the narrative. They framed the events as a race riot, casting the blame for the violence on black residents. This false narrative was widely circulated in newspapers and historical accounts, deleting the truth of what happened in Wilmington. For decades, the story of the Wilmington insurrection was never talked about. It wasn't taught in schools or acknowledged in public discourse. The descendants of those who lived through the coup were left to piece together their history, often with little more than oral traditions and fragmented records. The silence surrounding Wilmington was intentional. It allowed white supremacists to maintain their grip on power and ensured that the lessons of the insurrection would remain hidden. But the suppressed truth could not be erased forever. The Wilmington insurrection of 1898, often described as the only successful coup d'etat in the history of America, left a profound and far-reaching impact that influenced the social, political, and economic fabric of the South, and arguably the entire nation for generations. Its effects resonated not only in the lives of those who were directly affected, but also in the broader structure of systemic racism and white supremacy that continues to influence American society today. One of the most stealthy aspects of the Wilmington insurrection is its deliberate misrepresentation and erasure from mainstream historical accounts. In the immediate aftermath, white leaders and the press began to paint the events as a race riot, rather than a planned attack of a legitimate government that it was. This narrative shifted blame onto the black community and also reinforced the white supremacist idea that African Americans were inherently unruly and a threat to social order. Newspapers like Josephus Daniels News and Observer propagated this false narrative, describing the coup as a necessary act of restoring peace and order. This framing lasted for decades, solidifying a distorted version of events in public awareness. School textbooks in North Carolina and across the nation either omitted the insurrection entirely or emphasized the race riot narrative. The result was a widespread lack of awareness about the true nature of the event and its implications. It wasn't until the late 20th century, with the work of historians and activists, that the truth began to emerge. Even today, efforts to fully acknowledge and teach this history face severe resistance and opposition, highlighting the enduring discomfort with confronting the darker chapters of America's past. The Wilmington insurrection devastated the black community in ways that were both immediate and had a long-lasting effect. Economically, the coup stripped black residents of their wealth, livelihoods, and opportunities. Before 1898, Wilmington had been a thriving hub for black entrepreneurship and middle-class prosperity. Black-owned businesses like the Daily Record symbolized progress and independence. However, the destruction of these institutions and the violent displacement of their owners and patrons effectively erased decades of economic progression. Thousands of black residents fled Wilmington in the days and weeks after the coup, leaving their homes, businesses, and lands behind. This event disrupted lives, but also created a vacuum that white residents quickly filled. Property and businesses were often seized by white elites, further increasing their economic dominance. For those black families who remained, the barriers to economic success became nearly insurmountable, something they couldn't fathom. Systemic discrimination in employment, education, and housing ensured that the black community could not rebuild its prosperity to the way it used to. Politically, the coup marked the beginning of a new era of disenfranchisement and exclusion for African Americans in North Carolina and beyond. The white supremacist government that took over in Wilmington after the coup wasted no time in enacting policies that stripped black citizens of their political rights and power. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses were implemented to suppress black voter turnout and participation. The ripple effects of these policies were felt far beyond Wilmington. The success of the insurrection emboldened white supremacists across the South, leading to a wave of voter suppression and racial violence. The Democratic Party, which had orchestrated the coup, used Wilmington as a blueprint for maintaining white dominance through fear and intimidation. In 1900, black political representation in North Carolina had been effectively destroyed, and the state became a stronghold of segregation and disenfranchisement. The economic and political consequences of the insurrection also tampered with cultural dynamics. The narrative of Black inferiority, which was reinforced by the coup and its aftermath, became deeply embedded in Southern society. This ideology justified the exclusion of Black people from economic and political life and the systemic violence and discrimination they faced daily. Wilmington's Black community was left marginalized and impoverished, its potential suppressed by the weight of systemic oppression. The Wilmington insurrection solidified white supremacy as the dominant social and political force in North Carolina, and its legacy encroaches into the present day. One of the most significant aspects of this legacy is the psychological impact on both Black and white communities. For Black residents, the insurrection created a deep sense of fear and vulnerability. The knowledge that their lives, livelihoods, and even their government could be destroyed at the whim of white supremacists was a powerful deterrent to resistance. This fear was compounded by the lack of accountability for the perpetrators. This reinforces the idea that justice was unattainable for African Americans. For white communities, the coup validated the ideology that violence and intimidation were effective tools for maintaining racial hierarchies. It also normalized the idea that Black people could be excluded from public life without any consequence. This mindset permeated Southern society, influencing attitudes and policies for generations. The legacy of the insurrection can be seen in the systemic inequalities that endure today, from wealth disparities and educational inequities to the ongoing challenges of voter suppression and racial profiling. The cultural effect of the coup is also seen in the way it has been remembered, or more accurately, forgotten. This erasure has denied Black Americans their rightful place in history and also fostered the myth of white superiority. However, efforts to confront this legacy have gained momentum in recent years. Historians, educators, and activists are working tirelessly to expose the truth about the Wilmington insurrection and to share it with a global audience. Their research has challenged the hidden narratives of the past and shed light on the systemic injustices that formed American society. The Wilmington insurrection serves as a reminder of the consequences of unchecked racism and the importance of confronting hidden historical truths. Its legacy highlights the essence of systemic change and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. The long-term effect of the Wilmington insurrection of 1898 is a testament to the destructive power of white supremacy and the resilience of those who have fought against it. The event's erasure and misrepresentation highlight the importance of preserving and teaching accurate history, which has rarely been done. While we reflect on the damages and lessons in this dark chapter in American history, it is important to remember that the fight for justice and equality is still ongoing. The story of Wilmington is not just a cautionary tale, but also a call to action. A reminder that the past influences the present, and that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and inclusive society. Historians, journalists, and descendants of those affected have played crucial roles in reviving back the layers of distortion. One of the most significant breakthroughs came in the early 21st century when the North Carolina General Assembly commissioned a report on the Wilmington events. The report, which was published in 2006, meticulously documented the events of 1898 and offered an unflinching look at the racial motivations and political machinations that led to the coup. This report corrected the historical record and shed light on the economic and social ramifications for Wilmington's Black population. Some scholars like David Zucchino, author of Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy, have further amplified the story. Zucchino's Pulitzer Prize-winning work was a blend of rigorous research and compelling narrative to bring the insurrection to life for modern audiences. His book highlights the systemic nature of the violence and its enduring impact on race relations in America. Additionally, documentaries and media coverage have also played a vital role in educating the public. Films like Wilmington on Fire by Christopher Everett delve deep into the personal stories of those who lived through the insurrection and their descendants. These works provided a visual of the historical context, but also emotional resonance, reminding us that history is not merely about dates and events, but about people, their lives, dreams, and struggles. Community organizations and grassroots movements in Wilmington have also been instrumental in preserving the memory of 1898. In recent years, there have been concerted efforts to confront the legacy of the Wilmington insurrection. In 2007, the state of North Carolina formally apologized for its role in enabling and perpetuating the violence. While symbolic, this acknowledgement was a significant step in addressing a painful chapter of the state's history. Local leaders in Wilmington have also taken steps to honor the victims and their descendants. In 2019, the city unveiled a memorial at the site of the Daily Record, the Black-owned newspaper that was destroyed during the coup. The memorial stands as a testament to the resilience of Wilmington's Black community and a dark, gloomy reminder of the consequences of unchecked racism and political ambition. The question of reparations and restorative justice has been a controversial topic that has been discussed with no yielding resolve. Advocates argue that the economic devastation inflicted on the Black community, the loss of businesses, property, and generational wealth demands concrete compensation. Some have called for financial compensation to the descendants of those affected, while others emphasize the need for systemic changes, such as investments in education and economic development for Wilmington's Black population. Although there have been discussions, critics of reparations often face the challenges of implementation and the passage of time. Yet proponents counter that the enduring effects of the insurrection, which was manifested in racial disparities in wealth, education, and political representation, make reparative actions not only justified, but necessary. In recent years, younger generations have taken up the mantle of activism, pushing for a more inclusive narrative of Wilmington's history. Through social media campaigns, educational initiatives, and public demonstrations, they are ensuring that the lessons of the 1898 event resonate in the 21st century.
All right, so we can learn so much from these situations in these historical circumstances that have gone around. 1898, that was 100 years before I graduated high school. And, you know, it was absolutely nothing for a group of so-called white men to come in and just wreak havoc, and it be not even a big thing, and they can come back, 100 years later and 100 plus years later and apologize, and we think that means something, that's something good. Throw that mess out the window. Understand, you can't apologize for what's been done to these people. There is no I'm sorry, my bad, sorry that happened to you guys, even though they'll try to completely evade the responsibility of it, because it wasn't actually them that did it. It was those that came before them. But yet it was those that came before us as to why we're in this captivity. But we can't, we're still here. So you can't get away. I'm sorry. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And you're not going to get away. So you can play nice and act as you want. What's in your heart is going to be revealed, and it's not going to be revealed for our sake. It's going to be revealed for your sake, so that when you get your reward, when you get your punishment, you won't be able to say, I really didn't deserve that. You go, you got what you're supposed to have. And I'm gonna rest there. Go ahead.
Kind of where you were headed with what you just said. very profound. You know, a lot of people, you know, want to not take any accountability for what had happened and blame it on past generations. And you know, you were hitting on that a little bit, but check this out.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm getting this from Wikipedia, and we know to be careful with some of what Wikipedia, you know, what they post. But this is very enlightening and kind of goes along with what you just said. But all right, it says in early 1998. 100 years after, you know, this incident, same year you graduated, says Wilmington planned a series of Wilmington in black and white lectures. So they were planning on speaking about this incident and racial equality. And 100 years later, it says they brought in political leaders, academic specialists, civic rights activists, as well as facilitators such as Common Ground. One of the attendees, his name was George Roundtree III. He attended the discussion that was held at AME Church, St. Stephen's AME Church there in Wilmington. Now, this George Roundtree III is the grandson of George Roundtree, who was one of the well-to-do businessmen, white businessmen that lived in Wilmington that kind of put fuel to the fire and got this massacre started, right? Yeah. But this is what his grandson had to say 100 years later. All right. He said that his grandfather was one of the leaders of the 1898 violence. Roundtree spoke. He spoke of his personal support for racial equality. Sounds good, doesn't it? You know, he's for racial equality. He spoke about his relationships with his grandfather, and he spoke about his refusal to apologize for his grandfather's actions. He stated that the man was just a product of his times. All right. Other descendants of the coup participants also said they owed no apologies and they had no part in their ancestors' actions. You know, so to understand that this act was wrong and to refuse to apologize and to be unapologetic about it, you're right. There's a reward for all of this. If you could grab 2 Thessalonians. It's our verse. 2 Thessalonians, I believe we want verse 6.
All right. 1 second here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1.
2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Begin reading at verse 6.
All right. I'll put it on the screen here. All right. The book of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 6. Seeing it is a righteous thing with the Most High to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you, and to you who are troubled, rest in us. When the Adonai, Yahushua, shall be relieved from Shamaim, mighty Malakim.
That's right, So this is what we're doing now. You know, we want recompense for what has been done, and it's the scriptures tell us that it's a righteous thing, for recompense to be played out on those who trouble us, right? And this says a righteous thing with the Most High. So this one could come away with the conclusion that it's the Most High that's going to be recompensing, however, that's not entirely true. Pull Revelations chapter 2. Let's see. Revelations chapter 2, and we want begin at verse 26, and we want verse 26 and verse 27.
All right, it's the book of Hazon or Revelation, chapter 2, and verse 26. And he that overcome and keep my works until the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As the vessel of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I have received of my Father.
That's right. So, George Roundtree, you had the opportunity to try to make this situation, and your words wouldn't have been enough anyway. So let me start there. Your apology wouldn't have been enough anyway, but you show us the hardness of your heart, which is not just going to affect you, but there's going to be some brothers and sisters who look just like me that are going to ensure that you will be sorry for your actions, for your grandfather's actions.
Indeed. And for your lack of compassion and your very wicked heart to not even offer an apology, something as simple and weak as an apology. That's the easiest thing you can do. You know what I'm saying? Just to say, that shouldn't have happened. And I apologize. If it would have been up to me, it wouldn't have happened. You know, you could have said that at least, but you weren't even reasonable enough to say something that weak. Instead, he was a product of his time, and like that excuses it. And so therefore you feel no need or no responsibility or no don't care about the people who lost their lives in this horrible situation, and it just means nothing to you. And like I said, the Most High is showing you the hardness of your own heart. He's showing you your own wickedness. So when your recompense come on your head, you can't say, it wasn't me that did it. Yeah, he's showing you that you are deserving of everything that you get. And you're not getting away. You're not getting away. Your grandfather's not getting away. And everybody in between, none of y'all are getting away. You all will pay. There's a price to pay. You will pay.
Indeed, indeed. And man, my hat goes off to Black journals, as well as this came from Black Culture Unlocked.
Right.
Yeah, my hat goes off to them because they're doing some real research with bringing these situations to the forefront, situations that we were unaware of, or situations that perhaps that we might have forgotten about, that we somehow might have learned, because a lot of this stuff we didn't learn in schools. You know, a lot of this would have been something that we had just heard about, at the family reunion, or speaking to the older men in our families who who had gray hairs and who lived through Jim Crow, hearing stories from them, without them and the accounts that we hear here, a lot of this would be forgotten knowledge. One of the corrections that I would have for this video that we just watched, so many different times he called what happened an insurrection, or what did he call it? A coup, and he's accurate in that, but let's also call it what it was, a massacre. I wouldn't go as far to say genocide, but I definitely would say a racial riot, which ended up being a massacre. So, when things seem like they're going haywire for you, and when I say you, I'm not speaking about you or me. I'm speaking about the Gentiles who have wrath to look forward to.
Right.
So when these things are going on around you, understand that there's a reason why. And you can't even say sorry.
Exactly. Can't even say, that shouldn't have happened. That is the weakest thing you can say. That doesn't even take any effort. That doesn't even cost you anything. That shouldn't have happened. I really hate that went on. That was avoidable. That should have been avoidable. That should have never occurred. That should have never, and my family name, they should have had nothing to do with that. That's the easiest thing in the world to say. But, praises to the Abba. because I'll be honest, I'm glad that they feel like they don't have any responsibility in the situation, because again, it just shows the hardness of their heart.
Yeah. And somebody tried to correct him during this lecture that they had. You know, they tried to correct him and told him, like, look, you've benefited off of of the situation.
Yeah.
You know, he's this man, his grandfather was a lawyer, a Harvard educated lawyer there in the town when this happened. And that wealth only continued to build with the destruction of Black Wilmington. Like, that increased. So he's a direct beneficiary of what happened.
Exactly. Yeah. And they act like it's nothing, but praises to the Abba, because again, I'm glad he doubled down on it, because what does that mean? Because like I said, that's the weakest thing you can do is to offer an apology. Oh, I'm sorry, and that's the weakest thing. But it can make you look like you could be something that you're really not, and that's repentant, or wanting to put this thing aside and move forward. And you don't care about any of that. All you care about is the evil pride that you take in the evilness of your family members. So, all right, we're gonna go ahead and let this thing rest. We can continue talking about this all night, giving praises, honor, and great esteem to the Most High. Before we do that, let's remind you why this is such an important thing. Book of Romans, chapter 10, verse 1. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to the Father, the Ha'aba, for Israel is that they may be saved. We desire deeply that Israel is saved from our enemies, saved from the destruction, saved from the judgment, and put into a safe place until the return of Hamashiach. Also, how do we get to that point? Book of Ecclesiastes, chapter number 12, verse number 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear the Most High and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. It is so very important to understand that in the conclusion of the whole matter, we are to fear the Most High and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. At the end of the day, when it is all said and done, all the dust is settled and all the smoke is cleared, we will be judged, or rather we have feared the Most High and kept his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. I am Ya'akazaki Yahu, joined by my most esteemed Kenaniah, giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahweh, Bashem, Yahweh Shai, Hamashiach, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I say Shalom, Wa Baruchim, Shalom, Wa Baruchim, which is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait till the day when the Most High brings us back together and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High Power, under one covenant, back in our own land with a heart of flesh and no more a heart of stone, with our enemies, our adversaries, and all those who hate us under our feet. Until that day come, Shalom, family. Peace and blessings.
Shalom, Mishpachah.
All praises to the Abba. Kwam Yasha'Allah. Barak Hashem Yahweh. Hallelujah.